Welcome to Byte-Sized Tech, where we like to blend some casual conversation with insightful discussions on all the latest in technology and gadgets.
You know those things you can't stop thinking about?
Thanks,
The things that just make you go, huh, how does that even work? Or what will they think of next?
Yeah, well, this week we're diving into a whole stack of news stories that really capture how tech is impacting, well, everything. We've got venture capital drama, military tech hitting the mainstream, international trade wars that are actually messing with people's internet access, and even a little peek into how the U.S. is trying to hold its own in this whole semiconductor race against China.
Yeah, it's wild. It's really fascinating to see how all these stories, I mean, they seem kind of all over the place, but they show how technology is really becoming like this key part of global politics and economics.
Right, and social issues too, don't forget that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. This first story is about women in tech, and honestly, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's pretty disheartening to see that in Europe, all female founding teams only got like 1% of venture capital funding in 2024.
Yeah, 1%. It's a tiny sliver.
It's crazy.
And that really shows the huge disparities that are still around in the tech industry. And you know, this has some pretty big potential long-term consequences because you see, experience capital, like the skills you learn while you're working, that accounts for something like half of a person's lifetime earnings.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So the more experience you get, the more valuable you are to companies, and then the more you can make over your career.
Exactly. And with AI, you know, like it's poised to automate something like 70% of jobs, right?
Yeah.
So having those in-demand tech skills is going to be even more important in the future. But this funding gap, this means women could be way more affected by job displacement as AI starts taking over certain roles.
So it's not even just about missing out on investment opportunities right now. It's about potentially being left behind in this whole AI-powered economy that's coming.
It is. It's pretty sobering when you think about it like that.
Yeah, it is.
But on a more positive note, there are initiatives like the Women in Data Science, the WIDES initiative, that want to get to 30% female representation in data science by 2030.
Okay, 30%, that would be a massive jump from where things are now. How are they planning to do that? Like, what steps is WIDES actually taking?
Well, they're focusing on a couple things, education and advocacy. So they're putting together training programs, mentorship opportunities, and even networking events, you know, to support women who are already in data science.
That's cool.
Yeah. And then they also work on raising awareness about just how important diversity and inclusion are in the field, because it really does matter.
Absolutely. Sounds like they're really trying to create a more level playing field.
Yeah, for sure.
So what about our listeners? What can they do if they want to support WIDES?
Oh, there are tons of ways to get involved. You could donate to the organization. You could volunteer your time. You could even become a mentor yourself for women in data science. Seriously, anything helps.
Awesome. Great advice. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit to a company that's really making the splash in the world of autonomous systems, Shield AI. So they just got this huge, $240 million investment for their HiveMind enterprise software.
It's a lot of money.
It is. It is. So what's so special about this company?
Well, what's really interesting about Shield AI is that they're taking technology that was first designed for the military, you know, specifically these autonomous pilot systems,
Right.
and they're figuring out how to adapt it for businesses.
So instead of drones dropping bombs, we could have them delivering packages or inspecting bridges. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. HiveMind Enterprise lets companies basically create and manage their own autonomous systems. So that opens up all sorts of possibilities in a bunch of different industries.
Okay, so it's like Shield AI is kind of like Amazon Web Services, but for autonomous systems, taking something really complicated and making it easier for businesses to use it through software.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And like AWS, Shield AI's tech has the potential to, it could really change things.
Yeah, it's exciting to see this kind of dual use potential, where a technology developed for one thing ends up having this ripple effect across other sectors. It reminds me of Palantir. You know, they started with government contracts and then they switched to offering data analytics software for businesses.
Yeah, it's a similar path, and it makes sense, especially when you consider that defense spending is going up in Europe, and there's a bigger focus on autonomous systems in modern warfare. So companies like Shield AI are, well, they're in a good spot to take advantage of these trends.
For sure. And it'd be interesting to see how they manage working with both the commercial and the government sectors. Okay, now for something totally different. Let's talk about Starlink in Canada.
Yeah.
So they've been in the news a lot because of their amazing reach, connecting over 400,000 subscribers a lot of them in remote areas.
Yes, Starlink has really changed the game for internet access in Canada, especially for those rural and underserved communities we were talking about.
Well,
But there's been this kind of interesting development recently, and it really shows how technology and international relations can, they can get mixed up in some unexpected ways.
oh, this sounds good. Tell me more.
So, in the middle of all this escalating trade tension between the US and Canada, the province of Ontario decided to cancel its $100 million contract with Starlink.
Wait, seriously? So people who rely on Starlink for their internet are just going to be cut off because of a trade dispute?
Well, it's complicated, but the decision definitely shows how risky it can be to depend on a technology that's, tied up in these geopolitical moves. Because even if a technology is beneficial and people need it, access to it can become like a bargaining chip in these international disagreements.
That's a little unsettling. It makes you realize how much we just assume we'll have internet access and how quickly it could be disrupted by things totally outside our control.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds us that technology, even something like basic internet access, it's not separate from all the complexities of global politics.
Right. Okay, I think we need to move on to something a little less, I don't know, doom and gloom. Let's talk about semiconductors. You know, those tiny little chips that power pretty much everything around us. The competition between the U.S. and China to be the top dog in the semiconductor market is heating up. So what's new in this whole tech showdown?
Well, the U.S. made a big move back in 2022 with the HPS and Science Act, and that aimed to boost domestic semiconductor production. The idea was to make the U.S. less reliant on Taiwan, which is the global leader in making these chips right now.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's pretty important strategically to be able to control your own supply chain, especially for something as important as semiconductors.
Exactly. But there's been this, well, surprising turn of events recently that's kind of thrown a wrench in things. Former President Trump has actually called for getting rid of the HPS Act.
Whoa, hold on. Why would he want to do that? Isn't it in the U.S.'s best interest to be less dependent on other countries for semiconductors?
Yeah, his reasoning is complicated, and it's tied to his overall economic and political views. But if they did repeal the HPS Act, the consequences could be huge. It would probably mess up billions of dollars in investments that have already been made, and it would likely weaken the U.S.'s position in the global semiconductor market.
Wow, that's a big gamble. So while the U.S. is having these internal debates about their chip strategy, what's China doing?
Well, China is moving forward with some pretty impressive AI development, and semiconductors are essential for that. They've been putting a lot of money into their own chip manufacturing capabilities, and they're really helping homegrown tech companies grow.
Yeah, I've heard of some of these companies like DeepSeek. They're hitting some big milestones in AI development, and they're doing it way cheaper than their U.S. rivals.
That's right. And you can actually see this shift happening in the stock market. Chinese AI stocks are going up, while some U.S. companies are seeing their stock prices go down.
So it sounds like the balance of power in the tech world is shifting, and semiconductors are right at the center of it all. Okay, before we move on to our last story, I have to ask, any thoughts on how this whole semiconductor showdown will end?
Honestly, it's really hard to say for sure, but one thing is clear. Semiconductors are going to be a major point of competition between the U.S. and China for a long time. And how it all plays out will have big implications for the global economy, technological innovation, and even national security.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. Well, for our final story today, let's look at something happening a little closer to home. Utah just passed this law called the App Store Accountability Act. It's the first law like it in the U.S., and it's stirring things up in the tech world.
It is. This law is especially interesting because it deals with all the growing concerns about online safety for kids. It basically says you have to verify a user's age and get parental consent before anyone can download an app.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty big change. How does it actually work? Do kids have to, show their ID to download an app?
Well, the law says that app stores have to implement these age verification mechanisms, and it also makes parental control features mandatory, restricts how much data can be collected for minors, and even limits late-night social media access for kids.
Wow, they're really trying to cover everything.
Yeah, they are.
So what has the reaction been from the big tech companies, like Apple and Google? What are they saying?
It's been mixed. Some companies like Meta and Snap, who own Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, they've actually come out and supported the law. They say it makes age verification easier and it helps keep kids safe online.
I can see how that would make sense for them. It probably takes some of the pressure off them to police their own platforms.
Exactly. But then you have Apple and Google, and they've raised concerns about privacy. They're saying that asking users to give up sensitive information to verify their age could actually make things less secure and potentially expose people's personal data.
Ah, so it's that classic dilemma again. Safety versus privacy in the digital world.
It is. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers. So, in a way, Utah's law is kind of a test case, and what happens with it could influence how things go across the country.
I bet other states are watching really closely to see what happens. It could lead to a whole new approach to online safety for minors all over the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. And all the legal challenges that Utah's law is already facing, well, that just shows how tricky it is to figure out how to balance safety and freedom and privacy in this digital age.
Yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. So we've covered a lot today, from venture capital disparities to military tech going mainstream, from international trade disputes impacting internet access to the big semiconductor race between the U.S. and China, and then to this brand new App Store law in Utah.
It's a lot, and what's amazing is how connected all these stories are. We're seeing technology become more and more intertwined with geopolitics, economics, social issues, you name it. The choices we're making about technology right now, they have really big consequences down the line.
It's like tech isn't this separate thing anymore. It's part of, like, the foundation of our world.
It is, yeah.
And it feels like we're just starting to figure out what that means.
Yeah, it's a brave new world out there, that's for sure. And we all need to be ready to deal with it in a smart and responsible way.
Well said.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating and complex landscape we're in. It's not just about the technology itself anymore, it's how it kind of connects with every single part of our lives.
You're so right. And it makes me think, who's actually in charge when it comes to technology? Like, who's steering the ship?
Yeah.
Is it governments, corporations, or maybe even us, the users?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer. It's like this back and forth, this push and pull between all these different groups. Governments are trying to regulate things to protect people and their own interests. Corporations are focused on making money and innovating, pushing the limits sometimes without thinking enough about the ethical side of things. And then there's us, the users, and we're both shaping technology and being shaped by it at the same time.
It feels a little bit like the Wild West out there sometimes.
Yeah.
It's exciting to see all these new things happening all the time.
Yeah.
But it's also a little scary to think about what could go wrong.
I think that's a really good way to look at it. We have to be excited about technology and what it can do, but we also have to be careful and aware of the potential problems. And that means people need to be informed and engaged and willing to hold both governments and corporations accountable.
Okay. Speaking of accountability, let's go back to the Utah App Store Accountability Act for a second. You mentioned that it's facing some legal challenges. So what are the main arguments against it?
Well, the biggest argument is about privacy. People who oppose the law say that requiring users to give up personal information just to prove their age could create all sorts of security risks. It could expose that data to breaches or misuse. And they're also worried about the government getting too involved and the possibility of censorship.
So it's not just tech companies that are pushing back. It's also privacy advocates and civil liberties groups.
Exactly. They say that even though protecting kids online is a good thing, this particular law goes too far and could have some unintended consequences. It could affect individual freedoms. It's a really tricky balance to find.
It sounds like there are some valid points on both sides. So what are some of the possible solutions that could address those online safety concerns without sacrificing privacy?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Some experts say we should look at privacy-enhancing technologies like differential privacy that lets you analyze data without actually revealing individual identities. And others say we should focus more on education, teaching kids how to make good decisions online.
Education does seem like a crucial part of this. Kids are growing up surrounded by technology.
Yeah.
So we have to give them the skills and the critical thinking abilities they need to use it safely.
Absolutely. You can't just try to shield kids from technology. They're going to be using it no matter what, so we have to teach them how to use it in a wise and responsible way.
So it's not just about laws and rules, it's about creating a culture of digital literacy and responsibility.
Exactly. It's a multifaceted challenge, and you need a whole system approach involving governments and corporations, educators, parents, and, of course, the kids themselves.
Well, that's a lot to think about, and it sounds like there aren't any easy answers.
That's the thing about technology. It's constantly changing and evolving. It's complex, it's nuanced, and we have to be able to adapt and rethink our assumptions all the time.
It's like we need a whole new set of ethics for the digital age. Or maybe we just need to take the ethics we already have and figure out how they apply in this new context.
I think it's probably a combination of both. We need to build on those existing principles like fairness, respect, and responsibility. But we also have to acknowledge that technology brings its own unique challenges and considerations.
Like we're explorers in uncharted territory.
Mm.
There's excitement and potential, but we also have to be cautious and think carefully about each step we take.
I like that analogy, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations to debate the issues and figure out together how we want to shape technology so that it benefits humanity as a whole.
It's a big task, but it's also incredibly exciting. It feels like we're right on the edge of something huge.
We are, and the choices we make today will determine where we go from here. It's up to all of us to make sure that technology serves us and not the other way around.
That's a great point. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive into the world of tech.
I agree. It's been a really interesting journey exploring all these new developments and trends, and I hope our listeners have learned some new things along the way.
For sure. Thanks for joining us for this whirlwind tour of all things tech.
I know, right?
It really does feel like we're living in some kind of sci-fi movie sometimes. Like the speed at which tech is changing is just wow.
It is. And I think what we have to remember is that we're all part of this whole thing. It's not just something that's happening to us. We're actually shaping it with the choices we make, the technologies we decide to use, and even the conversations we're having about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes it can feel kind of overwhelming, like we're just along for the ride. But you're right, we do have a say in this, and we need to use it.
Exactly. And it all starts with staying informed, thinking critically about things, and having these really thoughtful discussions about the role we want technology to play in our lives, and in society as a whole.
For sure. And maybe even asking ourselves some hard questions, like what are the potential downsides of all this progress? What are the unintended consequences we need to watch out for?
Absolutely. We really need to be having those conversations now before these technologies become so ingrained in our lives that it's like too late to change course.
That reminds me of something you said earlier about needing a new set of ethics for the digital age. What would that even look like?
Well, I think the first thing is to recognize that technology itself isn't inherently good or bad, right? It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used in positive ways or negative ways.
So it really comes down to intention and taking responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. We have to be really aware of the values that we're building into these technologies. We need to be transparent about how they work and what kind of impact they could have. And we have to be accountable for what we do in the digital world.
That's a lot to think about, but it seems like a conversation is definitely worth having.
It really is. And it's a conversation that needs to include everyone, not just the tech people, but also policymakers, people who study ethics, educators, regular everyday people. We all have a part to play in shaping what technology looks like in the future.
So well said. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of Bite-Sized Tech. It's been, I don't know about you, but it's been a really eye-opening conversation for me.
Oh, absolutely. It has for me, too. It's
Yeah.
always so interesting to dive into these complex topics with you.
Thanks for tuning in to Bite-Sized Tech. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more fun discussions about all things tech.